and welcome to the Kink Perspective. My name is Chris. I'm a psychotherapist and consultant. On today's show, we're going to take a look at something that came to me in a message online. It got me thinking, and I believe it's going to be something that many of you are going to actually connect with. I hope at the beginning of your weeks, all of you are doing quite well. I know we're all starting out, getting back going. I just made a nice brisket stew for dinner tonight, some comfort food. So I've kind of got my dinner cooked. Hope you all got something planned well. Make sure you treat yourselves, right? You got to look after yourselves. Before I get into today's show, I really want to take a moment again, like I always do. I want to thank all of my longtime listeners, all of your comments, your questions, things you bring to me, and even all of those who are just showing up and finding the show now. Your support really does matter to me. And if you're listening on Spotify or YouTube, do me a favor. Take a moment, rate the show if you are on Spotify, hit that 5-star button. This allows others to find the show and some of these conversations that they may need to hear, right? It helps the show keep growing. And if you want to support the podcast directly, you're going to find a donation link in the show's description. Any contribution helps, no matter how big or small. Now, let's get to today's topic. Someone wrote into me about their experiences topping dominance, right? It's not completely uncommon. And they were curious about life on the other side of the slash. They had noticed that while men often voice some of the same levels of interest, when the same question was asked of women in dominant roles, the response was a clear no. The message pointed to something bigger here, social pressure. How much of our willingness or refusal to maybe jump the slash, if you will, is influenced by the expectations that surround us. So today, that's what I want to unpack. The social pressure that shapes our choices in kink. Why curiosity often collides with shame or fear, and what it means for those who feel the pull, that pull to explore the other side, but might actually hesitate to act on it. I've been asked over the years, over the decades, have I ever submitted? No, I don't. It's not in me. I'm innately dominant. It's kind of my position. But I think that there was a writing I was going to do once that I think I had titled in a way called "We Are All Submissive to Something." For some of us, that's love or certain relationships or our friends or our family, meaning more based on loyalty and connection, not necessarily in the submissive sense. So it doesn't really kind of cross over. But anyways, I'm digressing a little bit. So first, I want to talk about social conditioning and gender roles because I think it's going to be important that we get some context here. So when we start talking about social pressure, what we're really talking about is conditioning. Now, from a very young age, we all absorb messages about what's acceptable and what isn't, what's strong and what's weak, right? And what earns praise and what actually draws some criticism. And these messages don't come in a neat lecture, by the way. They come in subtle comments, little jabs, raised eyebrows sometimes, and little moments that repeat until they kind of sink into our psyche. Think about, everyday life. Someone speaks up directly, they make their points clear, and suddenly they're too aggressive or they're too much. And if somebody else stays quiet, they absorb that discomfort. They're called easygoing or just pleasant. These small reinforcements tell us just how to behave. But not only that, they also tell us who we're supposed to be. And over time, that becomes a script that we follow internally. Now, most of us aren't walking around with these scripts consciously in our mind, but they are running in the background. They're sitting in our subconscious or even in our unconscious, and we hear them, we listen to them, and they inform how we present ourselves in relationships, in our professional life, with our friends, with our family, and yes, even in the lifestyle. So when we look at the question of crossing the slash here, of maybe a dominant wanting to experience submission or a submissive wanting to take control, those background scripts suddenly come forward. They whisper, hey, that's not who you're allowed to be. Now, some people will say biology plays a role too, that certain tendencies are hardwired through evolution. Now, that may be true to a point, but what I want to focus on today is the weight of social conditioning, because that's what I want, that's what I see most often holding people back inside of the lifestyle. Now, here's an example outside of kink. Imagine someone at work who's always the one in charge. They're making all of the choices, all of the decisions. Now, if one day they want to step back and say, you know what? I don't want to lead this project anymore. I want to follow for once. The reaction they often get isn't neutral. People are going to be very surprised. They might even joke about it. And under that reaction is going to be deeper judgment. You're not allowed. You're not acting how we expect you to act. Now, in the lifestyle, this is magnified. The roles are more clearly defined, the dynamics are sharper, the expectations are much higher. So for a male dominant to say, I want to hand over control for the night, it doesn't just feel like play, it can feel like a direct contradiction to the script that they've been living with. And for a female dominant to say, I want to see what it's like on the receiving end for once, the pressure works the same way. It isn't just curiosity anymore. It collides with what they've been told is acceptable for them. And the psychological tie-in here is that our identity comes center stage. Now, when a person's sense of self has been built around being seen as strong, decisive, or even nurturing, stepping outside of that role feels risky. It can trigger things like shame or embarrassment, even self-criticism. Now, I've had people tell me, I feel like I'd be betraying who I am if I ever tried. And that's the weight of conditioning. It convinces us that trying something different doesn't just change our behavior, it changes our worth. Now, last year, I think it was last year, I've done so many episodes now, this is year 4, I did a show where I think I talked about parents and kink, and I had a couple that came and talked about it. And while he's the dominant in the relationship, there was something that he wanted to explore that can be seen sometimes less than. It was a wonderful conversation about communication and love, exploration and desire. And there was no hesitation in his partner's voice. They both engaged in the activity and then they moved forward. But for that moment, he got a chance to surrender and indulge. It doesn't make him any less worth. If anything, it made him stronger for voicing his opinion. And it was a brilliant show. If you haven't heard it, go back and listen. All right, season 3, I think it was early in the year. It was about parenting and kink, I think. Anyway, now, underneath all this conditioning that we face throughout our life, there's often a quiet pull towards our curiosity. That's what led a lot of us towards the lifestyle. There's something more for all of us. That desire doesn't actually vanish. It just gets buried under the fear of being judged, either by others or worse, by ourselves. That's why you see some people secretly crossing over in private or only with partners they deeply trust, while others, dismiss the idea outright because it feels too threatening to even acknowledge. So when we ask ourselves why crossing the slash is such a challenge, the answer just isn't simply preference. It's not just, I don't want to. More often it's, I don't feel like I'm allowed to. That line between what we want and what we've been told to want, right, gets blurred. And that's the tension I think many of us, whether we admit it or not, feel. Now, again, this applies you wouldn't believe it, quite generally to a lot of people feel this way. And I've conversed over the years, over the decades with different people. And but it doesn't make them any less. It just allows them further exploration, but that shame, that fear of what they'll be seen as, instead of the enjoyment they'll receive, is what holds them back. So I want to talk now about desire versus fear, because I think this is where we're going to start picking up some more of these elements here. Now, when we move past the conditioning, the next layer we run into is desire. And desire is really complicated because it rarely disappears just because we're told it shouldn't be there. Most people who've spent time in kink spaces will admit that at some point they have had a thought about what would it like to be on the other side, right? Maybe it's just a fleeting curiosity. Maybe it's something they've played out in their head more than once, but the thought does exist. The problem is what happens to that thought once it bumps into fear. Now, because fear doesn't usually shout, it whispers and it says, if you do that, you're going to lose credibility. If you admit this, people are going to laugh at you. And if you step into that role, everything you've built about who you are in this community is going to crumble. So that's why curiosity so often gets pushed underground. It isn't that people don't have it. It's that they don't feel safe voicing it. I've met men privately that have told me that they've wanted to submit for years, but they're terrified of being labeled less real as dominance if they admit it. And I've had women share that while they're interested in stepping into more dominant roles, they fear being called unnatural or too much, or sometimes even worse things if they lean into these spaces. Now, the common thread here isn't the lack of desire, or it isn't the fear of ridicule or rejection or being stripped of legitimacy in the eyes of others. It's all of these things being compounded at once, right? It's not just one little thing. That fear is real. So let me give you some examples without kind of naming anybody. Now, I worked with somebody who was a respected dom in his local scene, very well known, provided a space for the better part of a decade. Now, to everybody else, he was steady, he was confident, reliable, he was helpful, right? But in session, he admitted that he had longed for what most wanted to be experienced, what he did to others. He wanted to be held down, not to have to carry the weight of that control for once. He never told his partner because he thought it would undo all the years he had spent building his reputation as a dominant. His fear wasn't that he wouldn't enjoy submission. It was that people would stop taking him seriously. And that fear was so palpable for him, it held him back. And eventually, over time, a long time, it started out privately. He began to explore, but the exploration for his comfortability didn't exist inside of his own city. It didn't exist with anybody he knew, and it exists in a professional capacity. He limited his feelings so he could explore that side of his life. Now, on the other side, I've had conversations with women who've always identified as a submissive, but felt that spark of wanting to top. One in particular told me she wanted to try it out just to see how it felt to, hold the reins for a minute. But every time she voiced that thought, she got the same reaction. Jokes about her being out of character, or partners brushing it off as just some sort of weird phase. So this message got internalized. And she told herself, I'm not meant for that role. Don't even try it. And so what happened to that curiosity? It died. She tucked it away and buried it as a guilty secret. Now, the stigma works differently depending on the direction. For men moving towards submission, the fear is often about being seen as weaker, less valid, right? Not man enough. For women moving towards dominance, the fear tends to be centered on being too much, too forceful, stepping out of what others are comfortable with. But here's the thing, both are about shame. But the shape of that shame reflects the roles society has already carved out. Now, this creates a double bind. If you follow your curiosity, you risk being judged. If you ignore it, you carry the frustration of self-denial quietly. Now, either way, there's going to be a cost. And that cost gets a lot heavier the longer the desire and the fear are in conflict. So psychologically, what we're seeing here is dissonance. The mind is trying to hold two opposing truths at once. This is what I want, and this is what I'm not allowed to want. And over time, that dissonance eats at confidence. It destroys your self-trust, and sometimes it'll even destroy a relationship. Because if you can't voice your curiosity to the person closest to you, that silence creates distance. But here's what I want to emphasize. The existence of fear doesn't erase the desire. It just buries it. And buried desire has a way of leaking out through frustration, resentment, or acting out in ways that aren't safe or intentional. That's why these conversations matter inside of our lifestyle. Because when people start to acknowledge that fear as part of the process, they can also start to make conscious choices about how to navigate it, instead of letting it control them. So when we talk about crossing the slash, it isn't just a casual question of curiosity. It's a real negotiation between desire and fear, between authenticity and expectation, that internal struggle we have inside of ourselves. And for many people, that negotiation never makes it out into the open, which is why the stigma around it continues to have such power. And it's going to it's going to keep having that power of control over you, because if we can't even acknowledge our thoughts to ourselves, let alone bury it in shame because we are too scared to tell somebody else, then the authenticity we say we're striving for doesn't truly exist, because we're not even being authentic with ourselves. So now I want to take a look at internalization and the psychology around this, because I think it's going to be a little bit more important here that we get into this part. Now, one of the most powerful forces at play here isn't what others say to us. It's what we end up saying to ourselves. External pressure is real, and I'm not denying that. But what often makes it stick is the way we internalize it. It's even when I'm in session with somebody and they start to degrade themselves. It's one rule I have: you're not allowed to do that. Not when we are working together. Because if you keep repeating that pattern, all you do is hear the loudest voice is always going to be yours, especially in your head. Now, over time, we don't need anyone else to shame us, because we've already learned how to do that job on our own. And trust me, there is no one else that's better at internally shaming us than ourselves. And this is the heart of how conditioning works. When people repeatedly hear, "That's not how you're supposed to act," "That's not for you," eventually those words don't need to be spoken aloud anymore. They get built into our identity. So when desire arises, that runs against the grain of those messages. And the first voice that speaks up is often our own. And it reminds us to stay in that line. Now, in psychology, we call this kind of tension identity dissonance. It's that whole discomfort that shows up when what we want collides with how we see ourselves. If I've ever built my sense of self around being the one who leads or around being the one who serves, and suddenly a part of me wants to experience the opposite, the clash between those two, that battle, can feel really destabilizing. It isn't just about kink roles at that point. It's about who I am or who I believe I'm allowed to be. And in kink, this dissonance is magnified because roles are so tied to our gendered expectations. A man who submits can fear, it means he's giving up strength. A woman who dominates can fear that it means she's stepping into something people will, label as too harsh or under feminine. Now, I've met a lot of dominatrixes in my time, mistresses and everything, dominas and all whatever other terminology. I've met financial doms, and that's a different thing. I've covered that. That's not even... Anyway, I'm not going to go into that subject again. I've talked about that a couple Christmases ago. I've had that argument. But no matter what here, if no one ever says those things out loud, what you're feeling inside, the weight of those judgments live, and they will continue to live and eat away at you. And because kink often happens in our communities where reputations matter, that fear of being found out can intensify that internal policing of ourselves. Now, what's striking here is how subtle this self-shaming can be. For some, it comes out as dismissing their own curiosity before it's fully formed. I probably wouldn't enjoy it anyway, right? That's the first thing we're going to tell ourselves. For somebody else, it's going to be bargaining with themselves. I'll think about it, but, ultimately I'm not going to do it, right? And for many, it's just silence. They don't speak up about it. They don't write it down. They just carry it as a private thought they quickly push aside. Now, I'm going to take you all back in time here, about 20-some years ago, when I was starting to get my feet in the Atlanta community, and I really enjoyed it. I was traveling to New York. I was meeting with a mentor. I was doing some of the New York scene. And there was somebody there. There was somebody at that point in my life that had asked me that question. And maybe for like a millisecond, I kind of explored it in my mind. And for me, I thought about the question, but there's no appeal. I'm not one for surrender. But fair enough, I at least allowed myself the exploration moment to ask. There's nothing wrong with asking the question. It doesn't make you less than for asking it. You are deciding. If the answer is a resounding yes, well, then you move on to the next stages, and that's what we're talking about today, right? But if you stay silent, the cost of that silence is high. When people keep burying dissonant parts of themselves, it chips away at your authenticity. It chips away at who you are. And you might feel divided. One part of you saying, or playing a role that you're known to do, and the other part of you that you're keeping locked away because you're afraid of showing who you really want to be, at least in a moment or for just a day, right? And over time, that division can fuel frustration, resentment, or even burnout of your kink identity. I've seen doms who suddenly lose all interest in the scene, not because they don't enjoy the power, but because the unacknowledged pull towards surrender has been draining them for years. And I've seen subs who quietly disengage from play spaces because their curiosity about topping has never had the room to breathe. And they've never allowed it. They've never even wanted to entertain the conversation in any type of real form. The deeper layer here is that the internalization becomes a form of control. If society's voice is already lodged inside of us, then no one else needs to stop us from crossing the slash. We stop ourselves. And that's how powerful social pressure is when it becomes internal. It makes the fence invisible, right? And we just keep running into it. And it's no less real. And yet, the moment people start to name this, even just with themselves, if they start to admit it, there is a shift. They're going to realize the shame that they've been carrying isn't actually theirs. It's just borrowed. It wasn't handed down through your culture. It wasn't given to you through a relationship, right? Or through years of expectations. And all of this, all of a sudden, you get a chance. And once you can see it for what it is, you can finally start to separate your own authentic desire from the voice that's been holding you back. That's the psychological challenge of crossing the slash. It isn't just about switching roles. It's not just about confronting that inner critic that tells you those roles define your worth. And if you can quiet that critic just for a moment, just for a split second, you might find that curiosity that you've been silencing really has something valuable to teach you about yourself and who you are, what you want, and where you want to go. There are, I've often joked, I sometimes look at switches as being really greedy because they live in the duality of both sides of the role. But ultimately, I applaud them for it because it takes a lot of effort, a lot of, forthrightedness to really step into the ability to dominate and submit. It is possible. But don't sit in a corner and shame yourself and just say, I'm not going to do this because that's just can't be who I am. You are allowed to have that role. Just like you're allowed, in your exploration in kink, no matter how long it's been going on. Don't allow nothing stops you from coming here. If you want to take that next step, don't be your own worst critic. Step into it. Find someone trusted you can talk to. Explore the conversation. A conversation is free. Just have it, right? Now look, when it comes to the kink roles, the real challenge here isn't just deciding what we want to explore. It's asking ourselves why we make the choices we do. Are we avoiding certain roles because they genuinely don't fit us, or because we've been told we shouldn't? That's a question only you can answer. And sitting with it might tell you more about yourself than anyone else or any scene or any dungeon or play party or event or whatever the case may be ever could. Now, curiosity doesn't erase who you are. It doesn't betray your identity. It's simply another way of learning what makes you feel alive and authentic. If nothing else, I hope today encourage you a lot to give yourself permission to ask those questions without judgment, especially from yourself. Right? I'm going to be still I think in the future, I'm going to kind of explore this topic a little bit more because I know there is a lot of tension around it. Not in an unhealthy way or argumentative way, but I do mean that I think there are a lot of people that this is going to sit with, because I think a lot of people explore it or wrestle with it. Now, I'm going to move to another, as you all know or have been listening to the last couple of episodes, I have started a new segment on my show. More so you all can understand some of the stuff that I deal with behind the scenes, and maybe you can understand why I do what I do, right? So it doesn't look like I'm just cutting things out. So my new segment here is called You're Famous Now. And the more consistently you put your work out there, right, the more you're going to notice something, that people start projecting their own stuff onto you. Because not everyone likes, when they read something, how that reflects back at them. And instead of engaging with the ideas, maybe actually reading what you've said or listening to something you might have talked about, someone's always going to default to cheap shots or nitpicking, or worse, just straight up insults. And it's obviously easier for them to attack the message, or the messenger, than actually wrestle with something that's a little bit more complex. So this week I bring you the Gaslight Squad. Now, these 5 ladies decided to show up on a post that I wrote about. What did I talk about? I talked about victimhood mentality and how it shows up and how destructive it can be. Right? Now, I didn't talk about it. You all know that I work in trauma. The reality is I didn't talk about it from a trauma lens. I didn't talk about it from a CPTSD lens. None of that. Now, those things are real. And I'm not saying they're not. But let's bring in the first member of the Gaslight Squad. So this was the grad student who, obviously all that theory she's reading just works better in practicality than, 10 years of experience. Let me just say, you're wrong. Your theory doesn't mean anything, right? When you get out into the real world, because what I learned in school doesn't really translate into what I do at all. It gives me some foundation, but that's about it. Everything else you have to learn separately. But what was interesting from the grad student is that this particular person started projecting trauma and telling me that I didn't appreciate became this whole theme for these people, that I didn't appreciate the trauma aspect. Well, I didn't write about trauma. So then next, this nurse came in and she said the same thing. And oh my God, why am I not viewing this from a trauma lens? Because I wasn't talking about trauma, right? And then came in the Google trauma expert. I don't know who they were, but they're like, I Googled all this. I'm like, well, that's great, but I'm still not talking about trauma. I'm not. I was talking about victimhood and perpetual victimhood. And then the CPTSD queen. As somebody who has it, blah, blah, blah. Well, that's fine, but I still wasn't talking about that. Now, these women kept up this relentless attack. And then it got insultive. I mean, I blocked this past weekend. The final count was like about 78 people. Right? Because what they were actually doing was gaslighting me. Because I went back and had to reread what I wrote 3 or 4 times, going, what did I write that they see that I either spoke about trauma or CPTSD? I didn't do that. So when we talk about women can be just as bad at gaslighting as men, this is a clear example of it. Now, I'm not saying that these women are problematic per se. I don't know them. I've never interacted with many of them before. I'd never seen them. Nor are the things that they are facing, not upsetting. Have dealt with my own trauma. But when you use your issue to project and gaslight your behavior onto somebody else, that becomes problematic. So you are now famous because you don't know more, and you taking offense to something that somebody writes and projecting yourself and then telling the person who wrote it they are wrong because they're not seeing it through your eyes is gaslighting. So congratulations. The victims became the victimizers. Thankfully for me, if you all wondered why I didn't write too much this past weekend, because it's exhausting for me and I get tired. And That's why I kind of just took a small sabbatical. I think I dropped one more writing and something else and a couple of memes, and that was about it. But this was the first full weekend in years I don't think I kind of consecutively wrote every day, because it's draining for me. So I just want you all to kind of understand. That's not I'm abandoning you all, but sometimes Chris needs a break. I just need a break from it. And it's tiring. And I have a really good colleague. She's really happy that I enforce my boundaries. But I'll tell you, I am enforcing more boundaries now than I've ever had to, because as the conversations get bigger, there's more detractors. I'm not going to stop. This is my pledge to all of you. I'm not going to stop having these conversations. I am never going to apologize for anything that I write. If you don't like what I write, that's fine. If you want to disagree with me and have a civil conversation, that's fine. You start insulting me, you start projecting on me, or you start gaslighting, you're done. I'm just going to block you. You don't get any more benefits from what I do or how I'm trying to help. More so, take yourself back to school, go get a degree, go get your clinical supervision done, and then go practice by yourself, and then go get all those years of experience inside a lifestyle, and then you help others. But until you do, Gaslight Squad, you have now been relegated to you're famous now. Thank you for that. So let me know. Lord, tell you, sometimes it's really frustrating, guys. It really, really is. All right, I want to get back to the show because I've had enough dealing with the Gaslight Squad. I know this topic is difficult for many people. I am reminded there I do somebody I knew. They actually left the scene because he really wrestled with actually going from a submissive male to he wanted to become a male dominant. His community didn't really accept it because they just told him where he was going to be. So it actually drove him out of the lifestyle. I've kept in touch with him over the years. He's kind of moved. He's found a new community, and he's still back into his being a male sub, but he's trying to explore us being a switch. And I really am encouraging him to do so, right? I mean, I encourage any of you who want to do it, do it. And I, by the way, know plenty of female tops, dominatrix, pros that are out there. They sub a lot, right? It's just not uncommon. That doesn't make any of these, it doesn't make you less. That's what I want you to take away from this. There's nothing wrong with you. You're normal. And if you just want to experience that for a night, go experience it. Go live life, right? Suck the marrow out of life. Carpe diem. Do your thing, right? I do have a book out there if you all want to know, you want to buy it, you want to read something that's a little repetitive. Tangled Desires, the exploration between psychology and kink, or psychology and BDSM, wherever you can buy your downloads from. So it's available on your Kindles or ebooks. There is a hard copy of it. I have contacted Red Leather and Hi There Catsuit. I am actually going to try to sit with them this week, try to record for a couple future episodes, right? So just bear with me on that. We got that. I haven't forgot. I'm still working on a new community worksheet. Don't know when that's going to drop yet. Probably in the next few weeks. I'm just behind, guys. I really apologize. All right. But anyway, let me know what you thought about today's episode. Hit me up in the comments if you've ever felt this, right? If you've ever dealt with this, let me know. Maybe you helped somebody through it, right? Maybe you can provide some tips for some people, or if you've gone through it, you've changed, and how that's been beneficial for you, let other people know, right? Until next time, everybody, be safe, stay kinky.